Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another edition of TBR. I'm George Binns, and we're continuing with the discussion of what's going on in the city over the next couple of years. And to help us understand it, we have with us this evening the president of the City Council, Julie Flowers. Thank you, Julie. Welcome.
Thank you, George. Thanks for having me back. It's always a pleasure to be here.
So it's been a busy couple of years, and there's a lot of stuff going on in the city.
There really is.
And surprise, surprise, as we were talking just before the show, there's very little activity on the campaign trail. But there are some significant issues, one of them being the changes to the ballot question. And from my perspective, the third question of what do you do when somebody moves from one ward to the other, that's a no-brainer. It seemed kind of awkward that when the 6th Ward councilor moved, he had to go through a search process that shouldn't have been necessary. But the other two questions, one being a 4-year term for the mayor,
Yes.
and the other being the addition of 2 more people to the school committee, that's a little more in line with something going on. And the city council approved all of those before they went to the state to get approval to come back and put them on the ballot.
Yes.
Sometimes this process gets...
It's a complicated process, that's for sure.
So anyway, what was the thinking of the council and you in particular on approving those 2?
Sure, and thanks for asking this question. I think because of the timing and when it became clear that the ballot questions would in fact be able to be on the ballot, because as you said, this is a complicated process of reviewing and making changes to a city charter. And so just for a little context for voters, 'cause I think it can feel right now a bit abrupt that all of a sudden, wow, there's these 3 questions that are going to be on my ballot, and there wasn't a lot of lead time. And so just sort of for some context, as you sort of alluded to, it's changing a city charter is an in-depth process, and our charter prescribes that we review our charter every year ending in 0, so every 10 years. So a charter review committee was appointed in Beverly in 2020, but then we know what happened in 2020 shortly thereafter. Yeah. My predecessor, Council President Guanci, had appointed this committee. Former at-large Councilor Tim Flaherty was the chair. They did get up and running during the COVID lockdown, but it did delay the process.
Yeah.
So that's why I think we're feeling collectively probably like, whoa, this has been a long process, and voters are probably feeling, this is a topic I heard come up a couple of years ago, and suddenly here it is again.
Yeah.
So in between, as you mentioned, that council, the Charter Review Committee was at work. Proposed changes came out of that committee, went to the City Council, and then they also go to the mayor. And then the way the process works is that there were a couple different public hearings, some with the Charter Review Committee, one before the council to get feedback from members of the public. But ultimately, some back and forth between the mayor's administration and the council, because the next step for the charter is that it has to go, it's a home rule petition, which means, right, it has to go to the state legislature. So the mayor and council have to come around to some level of agreement to send an act to the legislature, which is what happened in our case. And I think you alluded to the 2 questions about expanding the school committee and also about whether or not the mayor's term should be 2 or 4 years. And I definitely don't want to speak for every councilor, but I think because both of those we knew all along were questions, measures that would go before the public, to me, they both felt like things that really voters should get to decide. And so I think, at least for me, that was part of my comfort level with, they were recommendations from our Charter Review Committee, but sending them forward to the ballot to me felt like a solid way to be able to decide collectively if those are the things that our city would like to see, because it really, instead of us, the 9 of us making those decisions for the future of the charter, voters get to. So one of the reasons why people, I think, are feeling that it's just come back at this point just has to do with that next piece of the process. When it goes through the legislature, it has to go through the House and then to the Senate, which it did
And then the
and then
governor.
it has to come back to, it has to get signed by the governor and then come back to us. So as soon as we knew that all those things happened, our city clerk was working on getting the ballots printed with the questions. And we do have now on the city website under election information, there is a voter info sheet, which people will be familiar with in the sense that when there's state ballot questions, we're used to getting sort of that red book that explains it and talks about a yes vote would mean this and a no vote would mean this. So it's a simple version of that in a way because it's really just dealing with these questions on our charter.
It's not that complicated,
But people can find that there and also in hard copy at the city clerk's office if they'd like to pick one up.
So back to the issue of why should we vote one way or the other on this? Did that come into your thinking at all? Are you in favor of opposed to, or you just think it's something that the voters should have a decision on?
Yeah, you mentioned the first question about whether or not a councilor or a school committee member who moves out of their ward, so that's really for ward-specific seats, should they be able to fill out their term if they move within the first 18 months? And as you alluded to, we did have that happen.
Yeah.
The charter already allowed for the last 6 months of a term. If someone moved at the very end of a term, they could serve it out.
So what we're doing is just expanding the time frame.
We're expanding the time frame.
Yeah,
and what you mentioned, I think, is what was in the mind of the Charter Review Committee in making their recommendations and was part of the council's discussion, which is you then do have somebody that voters have already chosen, as opposed to this sort of unusual situation that you alluded to where our charter currently, when you have to fill the vacancy, calls for the council to make that decision, which I think for folks felt like, well, that's sort of replacing someone that voters selected to represent them with someone that the 9 of you are choosing, who may be a great representative.
Oh, yeah.
But if we were to make this change, it would allow the person that voters had selected to continue to represent them.
Okay. So 4-year mayor.
4-year mayor, I truthfully, I have gone back and forth on this one in my head frequently. And so part of what I felt was that was one where I felt like the will of Beverly voters to me will really be informative about what the right choice for our city is. I definitely can see a real strength to the 2-year mayor term in the sense of it really helps to keep the person in that office accountable. Every other year, you're really out there, you're having to talk about progress to goals and what's happening and meeting with people. I also can see, and this was part of what came out of the Charter Review Committee in working with, we had a consultant that worked with them from the Collins Center, who's an expert kind of broadly on municipal charters in Massachusetts. And she said it's increasingly rare to have a 2-year mayor term. And part of it that I can see is that in a 4-year term, someone in the office of mayor has more time to sort of set a goal and then has time to bear it out and get results. That's just longer time to be able to say, we tried something that was really hard or challenging or tricky, but in the next 3 years, we really did get to the goal and bear that out. And the other piece is just the institutional knowledge piece. Right now, conceivably, we could have a situation in an election where every member of the school committee, every city councilor, and the mayor, all of us on the same 2-year terms, could all be voted out at once, and you'd have all new leadership. So the 4-year term would stagger that, and that's, I think, another argument in favor of the 4-year term. But truthfully, I really am unsettled.
For you,
still.
it's a toss-up.
I will need to decide before November 7th which way I'm going to vote, but I've really been giving it a lot of thought.
2 more school committee members. Do we really need them?
That was one that really came almost directly, I think, from the advocacy of both the current and the former school committee presidents. So President Abel and former President Silverstein really talked about how the work of school committees, and you know a lot about the work of school committees, I know you've been part of it, has grown as the expectations on schools have grown. And so part of what they were talking about was just in order to really keep up with the work and to better serve the community, having a multi-member body that sort of matches the size of the city council would be beneficial in terms of really being able to divide up and do the work necessary now for school committees. it's also an interesting question because it's really a question of having sort of these at-large members that are thinking broadly, although these are slightly different. This imagines 2 districts.
These are semi-at-large.
Semi-at-large, but 2 districts. But I do think there is something to be said for having, and I may be biased because on the council I'm one of those 3 people, but people who are thinking about both every individual ward and then sort of thinking broadly about how they all tie together. In a way that ward representatives certainly do too, but I think those at-large seats can help to take that broad step back too.
So again, having been on the school committee, and this is back in the days when it was a 4-year term. So I would like to know somewhere along the line why the city decided to make these 4-year terms 2 years, and now we're pushing back towards 4 again. So it's a little confusing. But so it's a complicated issue, I think, that they're making it much more difficult. Well, there's other things that are sort of on the back burner for a while.
Sure.
We went through a hot session a couple of months back when they were talking about the Bass River overlay, and because of the bridge problem, that's put on hold. The bridge problem is something else, indeed, where for one reason or another, nothing is going to happen for 5 years, on maybe even 13, and the lack of support from the state. And I see this problem showing up on Dunham Road, the same problem. It seems obvious to extend Dunham Road out to Essex Street. Now you got 2 entrances to it, and coming in off Essex Street, you're not going through a neighborhood,
Right.
a very heavily dense residential neighborhood would make it much more attractive. But it's just tied up. And what seems to be bothering me is that we're coming to a situation where there's all these little entities that have veto power over projects. The Coast Guard, the Corps of Engineers, the state, I don't know how many agencies they've got involved. And each one can stop the project, but there's nobody in charge to say, knock it off, this is important, make it happen. I always like that line from, I think it was Star Trek, where the captain goes up there, make it so, and we need somebody like that. And I guess that gets to be I think a frustration for you guys on the committee when you try to get something done. You've got a constituent who's got a problem,
Yes.
and it just grinds on slowly. So is there any way we can somehow or other motivate the process so that we can get more support? I don't know where we go. Who do we talk to? How do we motivate them?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right that is a real source of frustration. It certainly is for residents, and you're right. It is for me as a counselor when I have a constituent with a problem or a concern. I want to be able to help them get a solution easily and expediently, and I think the bridge is such a good example of a really big problem affecting a lot of residents. Ryleside most directly, but of course downtown, Goat Hill, and other residents of the city trying to pass through. And it absolutely has that frustrating feel of there's multi-levels of permitting, there's many organizations and agencies involved, and how do we make it work more smoothly? So a big piece of that, I think, has been, but needs to continue to be city officials, whoever ends up, there's not a lot of contested elections in this next round, but there will be a few changes. And so working together in a really concerted effort to keep pressure on and to work with our state representative, our state senator, and also our representative in Congress, Seth Moulton's office, because as you alluded to, some of these are federal permitting processes and some are state.
Yeah.
And so part of what's been happening, I think, that slows processes like this down is that they're all operating kind of in silos. They see their, a federal agency sees its particular process that needs to get done, and a different agency is looking at theirs, and they're all sort of just working them on their own timeline. And so bringing them all to one table, and for that we really do need the support of our representatives at the state level, our representatives at the federal level. We've started to really have that happen, and I think that's where we need to keep those kind of meetings where everyone's at the same table, being able to talk together. I know my Ward 1 colleague, Todd Rotundo, has been in some of those meetings. This directly impacts his ward. I'm really grateful that his voice as a council voice is there. Yeah. Todd's a great advocate. And so I think that's a big piece of it. And whenever we can, whenever there's these multi-tiered, multi-level problems where we've got different agencies involved, as you said, how do we find one path forward together? I think it really has to be about us as city leaders trying to draw all the different agencies together at one table so that we as a city, as city leaders, city councilors, whoever's in the mayor's office can say, we're all in one place. We all agree that what we need for our residents is this goal, and we need to work together right now in this moment that we're together to make that happen.
Well, the counterexample to this is Pennsylvania. I-95
collapsing,
went down with a bridge collapse, and the governor got in and said, fix it. And they fixed it as expediently as possible. Similar has happened in Florida with the bridge to the Keys.
Yes.
And they've worked on it rather diligently. And I can see the other half of the problem is when the state came in to explain what was going on, why they closed the bridge. Somebody wanted to know, why don't you fix it? Well, we got 600 other bridges. So this issue comes up of, I think it's almost endemic with federal and state government. They're very quick to build something, but maintenance, well, we'll get to it later. And I think this problem is starting to show up and catch up with us. We had a similar situation here in Beverly, I think it was about a year ago now. The elevator in the senior housing went out. And people living on the fourth floor are not in the condition to trek up there with a load of groceries. So these kind of problems, I think, is something that comes up that start to wonder, because I've raised some issues with my local city councilor, and then he raises the issues with the advocate in the mayor's office, and nothing happens. So even at the local level, I think, so I think one of the issues that the city council needs to get into a stronger position to make something happen.
Yes. Yeah, and I think a example of where we've really tried to lean into that, and I agree with you, I think the more that the city council can continue to be both an advocate for people and also be working to be that public kind of conversation where different voices can be in the same room. So the National Grid project, the resiliency project that's been on Wellman Street in Goat Hill for 13 months, I think. Yeah. It will ultimately, I know you're familiar with this project too, but it will ultimately continue. It will have to run all the way down Lothrop Street. So we're not done with this project by any stretch. The impact on the folks on Wellman Street and on Weber Street and Goat Hill has been profound, because once the ground was open, of course, there's a lot of ledge. And so that's one where the city council, we really worked collectively very hard before granting that grant of location, which there's a lot of reasons why with state processes with utility work, you do sort of end up locked in on the specific location the state has cited, but what we could do is put conditions on it. And so we worked really hard to put conditions on the grant of location to try to best mitigate impact on residents, or to create ways that we could hold National Grid accountable. And we actually did just have them back in, the National Grid team, to give us an update. They do have to meet every other week with our Citizen Advisory Committee, but we wanted to hear an update in front of the full council to be able to talk about what we see that our residents need, and then to have them back again in the next several weeks when they're adding more crews to try to work more expeditiously. But we want to stay on top of that. And I think that's a really good example of what you're talking about, what local government can do if we really can work together but continue to both be a voice for residents, but also have those check-ins to hold people accountable to steps along the way in projects, in processes, and when things aren't going well. Some of what's been happening on Wellman and Weber is just, it's taken longer and it's been grueling on the residents, and so we really need to be having conversations with National Grid about how we keep trying to make that right for them, or how we continue to improve the situation for folks who've been living with this project for so long.
So I think that gets to another issue, that there needs to be more transparency and better communication with the citizens of what's going on. An example of that is they're going to put a 5-story building on Cabot Street. And several people got upset about it's too big. The company by right could build a 5-story building there because that's what the zoning law said. So, okay, that's a wake-up call to rethink the zoning. Do we really want to have Rantoul Street duplicated on Cabot Street? So that's a good question, worth acting. And then they've got to be a situation of, we're going to lose the parking, which is another issue that Beverly struggles with, downtown parking.
Yes.
And then it got thrown into the mix. Okay, we're going to renovate City Hall. So it ends up, we're going to, right now as the paperwork is flowing, we're going to spend something like $34.5 million to renovate City Hall, which is assessed value of $2.6 million. This kind of a discrepancy, a disparity, makes you, what? Why are we doing this? And is that really the best solution, and why? And I think anybody who looks at it can come up with a better solution, at least in their own mind. But we need to have an understanding of, do we really want to spend that kind of money on City Hall? And why are we doing it? And we didn't get nothing. And I don't think the City Council got much of an answer either when you had to vote on it.
Yeah, and I think that will be an ongoing conversation. I know that's the plan that was laid out before us, but as I think we're all sort of aware in our own circles and ways, construction costs right now, like many costs, continue to rise. And so I do think there'll be a chance that'll be an ongoing conversation to sort of reevaluate what is possible, what's really being proposed at this point by the administration for the city to move forward. I agree with you. Your initial point about communication, that's really important to me. And I think we, as a city, we could always be doing better with that. And one of the things that I've tried to lean into a lot as the president of the council this past term is trying to create even more of that transparency and communication. So, I think sometimes members of the public are always welcome to attend our meetings, but if you don't attend all the time, which no one would be expected to, those agendas can be dense and the meeting flow can be unusual. Public hearings have to open at a certain time. They suddenly are recessed. So I think sometimes it has the effect of feeling like you're sitting there and the meeting is changing in order. So I've really tried to lean into trying to demystify, make welcoming and transparent what's happening each step of the way, and communicating out in the avenues that I have about what's happening in the city. And I know other councilors are doing that as well, but I think you're exactly right. With so much happening in our city, it's really busy right now. Communication is extremely important because residents have to feel like they're aware of what's happening and that they have access to ask their questions and to understand how they might impact the processes.
And the other issue I think that needs to be explained a lot better is the concept of the city depending upon new growth to finance everything. And again, this is a term that gets thrown out, and what is that? It's not obvious. So part of the problem is there is terminology that the city inherits from the state that you have to use, but it doesn't get translated to the people who are forking out the dollars to cover it. But anyway, so as we mentioned early on, this is kind of a quiet campaign season, but you're running anyway. So
I am, yes.
would you like to ask your constituents for their vote?
Oh, thank you very much, George. As George said, this is an election year, and we have an election happening on November 7th at all polling places across the city. You can go and vote as you might typically do. But I also want to remind folks that early voting starts this Saturday at City Hall between 10 a.m. and 5 p.m. So that's the first of the early voting dates. You can find all of the early voting dates and times on the city clerk's page of our city website under election info. So if that helps to make voting more accessible, certainly do take advantage of one of those opportunities, but make sure to get out and have a chance to vote. As George and I talked about, there is a contested mayor's race, but these ballot questions about the city charter will be on your ballot, and you have a chance to make your voice heard on those. And you do have a chance to then think about who you would like to represent you. And I would be extremely honored to have your vote again for another term as councilor at large. It's been truly an honor to represent you over these past 3 terms. This term as president, I have also been really honored to get to lean into that role. I certainly learned a lot watching my predecessor in that role, and have tried to really step into that space to help conduct the meetings for the council in a way that makes them accessible and really welcoming for members of the public. Having members of the public come and speak before the council is one of the most important things that we have on our agenda each meeting. And I would love another opportunity to continue to represent you, to work hard for you, and to continue to work to, as George and I talked about, improve communication and to help increase access to the city for you, and just to help solve some of those problems that are on the horizon that we've talked about here, and the small ones that you see every single day and that you reach out about. So I appreciate all of the correspondence and look forward to another 2 years.
Well,
Thanks, George.
Well, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, for joining us this evening. And as Julie said, there's a lot of issues going on. Think about them and vote about them. And if you have some comments at the end of the credits, there's my email address. Feel free to send me your comments. And if you have a longer statement you would like to make, there's room for you here at the table. Thanks for joining us, and we'll be back.